find time judging people. Write stuff down.
I've always seen
Oh,
back.
Mike.
Judging people.
Mike, I might have to leave for a few seconds because then my pizza is here.
Fine.
Pizza, so you like this. The whole place is gonna smell like pizza, and then the stuff getting.
Good.
I've eaten, but
Pizza? Pizza where? What pizza?
Yummy,
yummy pizza in my tummy. Hi
She
everyone!
didn't ask. That's
So we're gonna talk about judging. You're all so far away.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was in awe of your throat and stared in like.
I'm not that ugly and
Who wants
evil.
to call for pizza for a
Mike
hot
is
cookie?
doing a workshop now.
So
yeah.
so we're gonna be talking about judging. Who of you have judged before or not?
Once.
With you, General.
Okay, so just not Tom, but we're just gonna go into it. So one thing that I usually don't do, what I'm gonna do, no, first I'm gonna talk about the content, what we're gonna talk about. Why should you judge? Because quite often there's this aversion versus judging. It's like, oh, I want to speak. How do you judge? Which is going to be the bulk of the workshop, of course, and then some tips and tricks. Firstly, something that I usually don't do, but why am I awesome? So why should you listen to me when it comes to judging? So I judged one of the final rounds, one of the semi-finals in English as a second language at the European Championships. I was the chief adjudicator of 2 competitions. I broke at the Oxford IV twice consecutively, and even more stuff.
Is that the right answer? Yeah.
What?
I was wondering which competitions, but did they end as we?
Yeah. Cool. So I'm very highly educated and I have the best words. I wanted to fade that one in and then show it now, but it doesn't really go. Anyway, why should you judge? Because it's fun. So I think actually I like judging more than speaking. I'm not sure why. I think it largely is because of afterwards you can give feedback to people and you can see that people actually grow, which is good because you can pass on your knowledge towards other people. Doesn't mean that if you think that you know less, that you're less experienced, that you don't judge, because quite often you do see gaps in other people's argumentation. And it's also just quite often you also see gaps in argumentation that you would have also made yourself, but you only notice them afterwards, and then when judging you can point them out like, hey, this was a gap that I really needed. I'm going to be talking about how you see those, what if these are actually important. But one thing also is that we actually need judges, right? If we want to become better as a society, then we would need people to give feedback, to be able to judge debates quite well, and to show, hey, Martin, maybe you should work on comparisons. Hey, Maciej, maybe you should learn on how to prove the truth of your argument, stuff like that. So we need people, but also at tournaments, quite often tournaments have an N-1 rule. That means that if you send N teams, you have to send N-1 judges. That is, if you send 3 teams, you have to send 2 judges, 4 teams, 3 judges, something like that. And that also means that we need people to be enthusiastic about judging as well, so they will want to judge. And it's just, I don't know, it's a lot of fun to do. Cool. So just in general, how to judge. Again, I didn't do the fade-in, so it's going to be all in one go, but let's say. So firstly, who is the... Oh, I did do the fade-in? No. Okay, who is the judge? So sometimes you will hear people say that the judge needs to be a tabula rasa, that is a clean sheet without any sort of knowledge. That is not true. I think one thing that a judge needs to be is an average informed voter. That means that that person knows some things about the world. They know that America exists. They know that Trump is in office, that he doesn't like certain groups. There is some tension between him and North Korea, but they don't necessarily know specific details of that conflict, for example, the same way as in they probably know that supply and demand are a thing in economics, but they don't necessarily know how that model works. That means that speakers need to be able to explain everything step by step to their judges, but that also means that it's quite a difficult step for some judges, is to leave your expert knowledge out of it. So if someone would have to explain something to, I don't know, like Lisa, who studies economics, about economics, then they would have to explain that more thoroughly to her than she would have to understand it, so she would probably understand it. Hiya. She will probably understand it earlier then the speaker has finished. However, she needs more information than that. Cool. But also, there's no extreme faults towards either side, right? So that means that you're not necessarily extremely right-wing, but also it holds that you're not extremely left-wing. Now, this seems somewhat weird, because if you go to tournaments, you will notice that the debate community is tending to be much more left-wing than right-wing, and much more progressive than conservative, meaning that judges are probably more likely, Problem
As
judges
a
are.
leftist, I disagree.
Huh?
As a leftist, I disagree.
So I think in general people are more leaning towards thinking for equal rights. For you often hear this idea that if you bring an extension, then it would have to be about minorities, for example. Those would be good extensions. So largely these are things that people would agree about. But that doesn't mean that conservative arguments are out of the debate. I think you can still make them in a good way. Just know that a lot of judges will be less likely to buy them. But if you bring them with good analysis behind it, then they would have to buy it. And otherwise you can just burn them down, right? If at tournaments you can go to the chief adjudication team and say this judge was shit because they didn't buy it. Something that I would agree with. For example, principled arguments that don't necessarily have consequences versus things that actually have consequences in the world. Something we will talk about next week. Okay, so a few more things on judges. So in general, judges are just intelligent, open-minded, and neutral observers, but they're willing to be persuaded by either side, so they don't have extreme faults towards either side. But they do have some shared fundamental moral beliefs. So, for example, they believe that freedom, happiness, life are good things, right? Some fundamental goods in society. And they're also moderately in favor of democracy, free speech, stuff like that, right? Things that you would generally say are pretty good things within society. Same with equal treatment. So that's where more of the progressive kind of things come into play. That's kind of who a judge is. So just the general notice of that in a second. Just the general notice of it is try to leave your expert knowledge and your personal feelings outside of it. It can be difficult, but it just means getting used to, I guess.
For some of the things you can just say to judges, less people dying, that's nice. You don't have to explain to judges why less dying and sad people is nice. I think that's intuitive. But some people do. I also did in the beginning, just yelling, and then we get democracy and freedom, and that's fun. Some things you have to explain, for example, when you take away freedom of people, but you get more democracy, you have to explain why the one is more important than the other. The same with minorities. Some people just yell minorities and they hope just that the judges get so happy when hearing the word that they automatically win, but they have to explain some more on why that's nice and important and why it works actually.
Yeah, so that's something we'll be talking about next week, how you actually do that, and also something later in the presentation about what that would be. So just in general, how would you judge? So how you would judge teams is just on their general persuasiveness. Whom of you have heard of the ethos, pathos, logos kind of thing from Aristotle?
I have a rhetoric lecture
Yeah.
about this.
No, some people didn't.
I didn't like it.
Okay, so the general idea is that persuasiveness is based on ethos, which is kind of you being having some authority towards the audience, so they kind of know that you are reliable onto what you talk about. Pathos is about striking people in the heart, and logos is about actually having logic behind it. Now, note that the majority of debate speeches you will want to focus on logos, but it also means that implicitly you still weigh style into it, but it doesn't probably give you the upper hand. So if indeed Maciej would show up in a suit and he would use very fancy words and stuff like that, but still his arguments would not be as strong as the opposition, he would probably still lose, because that's the one thing that you judge on. However, it would make you more persuasive if you would be more nuanced in your explanations, stuff like that, right? So that means that just in general, a closing team, for example, closing government, might beat opening government because they explained in more detail and more nuance that how their mechanism works, for example, right? Why their arguments are actually very important, and you only believe them or believe them even more after their speech. So some things under persuasiveness that teams always need to prove, and these are some things that we'll also get into next week, how you can prove them. Firstly, truth. So in general, an argument is made up of truth and importance. You can kind of somewhat numerically multiply the two to get a result, right? That means that if a team makes a very important sounding argument, but they never show why that is true, that argument is probably not credited. If they say, North Korea is going to throw nuclear bombs at every single country in the world, that's highly important, right? But it's no way near true, and you don't know why that is, and they probably are not able to make that link, meaning that argument is not persuasive whatsoever. Same thing with the truth thing. If you explain very well why North Korea is a dictatorship, so I don't know, but you never show why that is important or why that is harmful, stuff like that, that means that that argument is probably also not persuasiveness. That also means, with regards to, for example, the burdens of proof thing, is that you always need to, that you always have a burden of proof that you have. For example, a closing team has the burden of proof to bring an extension towards the debate. It means that if you don't bring something new to the table, that you will probably take it very low in the debate. Doesn't mean an automatic fourth, but something else. We'll talk about that in 2 slides. Then comparative weighing, and this is probably the most important thing in judging that you should always do. Comparative is, I still think it's a word like that doesn't really exist, but that was come up by in the debating community. It kind of means comparable or to compare things. That means that you always need to weigh up arguments compared to one another. So, for example, if you're weighing up opening government versus opening opposition, you say they had a really good argument about banning smoking and it being unhealthy. They had a really good argument about freedom to choose, for example. I'm not necessarily sure which one of the two weighs up against each other. So if we are talking about weighing up arguments, you always need to show why one argument is better than the other. Right? That's something you do in speeches, but especially in judging, you need to be able to explain how that works. Why? So one thing is that you always compare 2 teams at a time. Right? If you compare 3, it's going to be quite difficult. So let's say that we're comparing the opening government and the opening opposition. We want to know who of the 2 beat the other, right? So what would we see? We would see that, for example, they had an argument about, let's say, the usual privacy versus security thing. They explained really well why privacy is so important, why that calls for security, safety, why people feel nice, how that gives identity, yada yada. And they just say, well, but it gives security and nothing really else. Then what you would have to do is not just say, we thought that it was better developed, but in what ways was it better developed? So, for example, they've shown the truth and the importance really well, and then you say what they actually said. And then afterwards, you can also say opening opposition didn't really prove the truth of their arguments. I wasn't sure why security would be achieved or why security is so important. So that means that opening government beats opening opposition, for example. Yeah? Maciej, you had a question?
No, just wanted to shake the cool t-shirt.
Oh, cheers. Yeah. So that's one thing. Always be comparative. So always say that what chairs will always often ask is, why do you think opening government beats opening opposition? That also means that you need to compare these 2 teams, and you can never bring closing government into this because you're only weighing them up. Get into tips and tricks later, how that is very handy to do so and why you cannot be tricked. For example, if these people are not rebutted by opening government but only by closing government, that means that you cannot take that rebuttal into account when weighing off these 2. And you're probably saying opening government didn't rebut it. I still believed opening opposition at the end of the deputy leader of opposition, that is this person. Then that means that opening opposition beats opening government, right? Then afterwards, closing government rebuts them, and probably closing government then beats them. We'll get into that later. Cool. Questions about this? No? Awesome. Opening teams. So one thing that you do not do is punish teams. So quite often there are some judges that start out and say in a policy motion, so this house would do something, opening government gives no definition of how they would do that. That doesn't mean that they are directly punished in means of their individual scores or their position within the debate. It probably makes the debate messier. However, that can still happen, right? At the moment that one team does bad, that means that another team can always do worse. So, for example, opening government cannot be punished for setting up a messy debate, right? That is up to opening opposition to then tackle, which kind of leads into the second thing. If opening government does give a messy definition and opening opposition does not attack that, you do not punish them. You probably just give that as feedback in the end towards that. So you probably will always weigh them off on the arguments that they do bring and the contributions towards the debate, as we explained in the last 2 workshops by Jos and myself. Yeah, so that is kind of the thing, and then this is just in addition to the slide before, right? Because the general principle is always to judge people on their general persuasiveness. Okay, closing teams. So one thing that comes into the debate is creativity, of course. So where we said that you have like truth times importance, you probably multiply that by creativity as well. That means that at the moment that they don't have a very new case, that means that the creativity is probably less. But there are several things here. So if you have a closing team that brings a completely new case towards their opening team, then that scores highly on the creativity kind of ladder, right? But they still need to prove the truth and the importance. Also, rebuttal is also constructive material, right? At the moment that closing government stands up and only gives rebuttal towards the opposition teams, that was new and wasn't brought up by opening government, that is still constructive material. Why? Because maybe they flagged it like rebuttal, but they could have also said, we have this argument, and it happens to take down the other person's arguments as well, right? It's just them flagging it as rebuttal doesn't mean that it's not an argument anymore. So it is possible for a closing team to win a debate purely on rebuttal, right? Because at the moment that they have really strong rebuttal towards both opposition teams, they would probably win it over them, and if that rebuttal is so strong as constructive material, they will probably also beat their opening team. Would be possible. Last thing, and this is something that a lot of judges still do wrong, if you have an extension, that does not mean that you beat your opening team. Why? Because it's simply your duty to bring in an extension, right? It's also your duty and your burden of proof to prove why you beat your opening team, so why your extension is more important than your opening team. However, if you have no extension whatsoever, you pretty much only repeat what they say, you're pretty much guaranteed to take it under your opening team, right? Because you have no constructive material to the debate, everything you said was pretty much repeated, so that means that I don't know why you beat them, right? Yeah. So just pay attention to that. If you have an extension, just say, okay, let's see if they proved why they beat their opening team. Okay.
Doesn't your last point go against what Jos trying to explain to us on the closing government? That, for example, you can do two things. You can either build up a new case or help build on OGs, for example.
Yeah, but that would be an extension. So, for example, if at the end of opening government, they've proven the importance of their point, but not the truth, and you add to that truth, that means that you have an extension towards their points, right? You extend on them by proving why you can believe opening government. That also means that, for example, Jos talked about whipping your opening team, right, to summarize your opening team instead of your own team. That would also be a contribution towards the debate because you show why the government case as a whole is important in the debate, right? Would probably still mean that you would take it under your opening team, but you could still take it over the opposition teams, right? Just means that if you pretty much say nothing new, maybe add some examples or something, you have nearly no extension, and you're likely to take it under your opening team, right? That's why it also says near guarantee, because otherwise other teams can also do worse. If closing government doesn't give an extension and close an opposition, doesn't mean that you at least, I don't know, like lose the debate entirely. Yeah? Cool. Alright. Yeah, so the judging in itself during the debate, is that clear? Few things to add. POI, points of information, when someone stands up in the middle of the speech and asks a question, generally do not affect the judge ranking, but in close calls. So, for example, if we are, let's say that we're not sure who of closing government and closing opposition beats one or the other, they're kind of tied, but we see that closing government took no POIs whatsoever from closing opposition, and they took 2, which they answered successfully. Probably closing opposition beats closing government, right? That's something that only probably works in ties. One thing that also is important, and this is something that Jos also talked about a little bit last week, is that, let's say we're unsure about these two teams, for example, or just two teams that come after each other, which is always the case. That means that at the moment that we're not sure which one of these two won, we're probably favoring the opening team because they have a burden to prove why they are more important, or a burden to rebut the opening team, right? Because they come later, they have more opportunity to do so, and it would be just unfair for them to expect to rebut that closing team, for example, right? So that is why quite often, and I think that's a good development that is happening right now, is that you get the feedback from judges at tournaments, you took it under opening opposition because you did not rebut them, or because you didn't show why you were more important, stuff like that. Yeah, cool. Okay, the discussion. So that means after the debate, you're going to be sitting with the rest of your judges, of course, to discuss what the final ranking will be, right? Because you do need the whole judge panel to at least be that thing, to all have the same thoughts, or that at least when you take a vote that you have a call. When I say call, I mean the result of the debate, right? That's something that you'll hear quite often. Ties and draws are not possible, right? I talked about how they might be might be in a tie before, but there will always be a tiebreaker, right? That means that you cannot give, for example, this call, right? You cannot place these two at the same position. what does happen is that splits are possible. Those are disagreeing results, like what I said before about EBO. What then might happen if you have, let's say, 3 people in a judge panel, and you've already made, let's say, this call, but this one is really close, right? Maybe 2 people in the judge panel think that opening opposition beats opening government, and 1 person thinks the other way around, right? Everyone got that? In the end, the majority wins, right? Doesn't mean if that person is the chair or a wing, it's just majority wins. So that would mean that this happens. And then we call this a 2-1 split, right? 2 people in favor of the opening opposition, 1 against. What can happen is, let's say that you have 4 people in the judge panel. 2 people are in favor of opening opposition, 2 people are in favor of opening government. In a second. What do we think happens? Jack?
I guess they talk about it until one changes their mind.
Yeah, but at tournaments you quite often have a limit of 15 minutes towards your judging, and you need to make a call. And you have made this vote, 2 and 2. What happens? Yeah?
Then the chair decides.
Yeah, exactly. If there's a 2-2, then it means that the part where the chair is has the winning vote. We would still call this a 2-2 split, for example, but then the chair, of course, decides. Machi?
Oh yeah. Why it isn't that at the tournaments when there's a 2-1 split, it is not announced to the room that there has been that it is only announced to the room that has been a split,
Mm-hmm.
but they do not announce the numbers. So for example, there was a 2-1 split or 3-1 split.
Sometimes that happens. I think that's totally up to the judges. Like usually whenever there was a split in my rooms, people said it. One thing that won't happen is that, for example, let's say the 3 of us judged and they were the 2 in favor of one team and I was the other one. Let's say David was chairing, then David wouldn't say, well, and Mike was the split, like this loser or something like that, because you still have privacy to uphold, and maybe they want to disclose it themselves, maybe they don't want to. You won't often see splits, but we'll talk about that, now. So, first to the last point, I kind of did it in a weird order. Note that automatic firsts and fourths do not exist. So that means that if opening government screws up the model, that doesn't mean that they can always take a fourth, right? Because one team can always do worse. The moment that opening government stands up, gives a shitty model, but then gives some relevant arguments, and opening opposition just stands up and says, haha, unicorns exist, I shit rainbows or something, they would probably do worse. But if opening opposition does that, they don't take an automatic fourth, because Mache or me can just stand up and go, and then leave, right? That, like maybe saying nothing whatsoever would probably mean you would take an automatic fourth, but just in general, if you say stuff, it wouldn't exist. Same thing with automatic firsts. Sometimes you also see people judging on, for example, reputation, which is something that is changing, luckily, which means that people that do well usually in tournaments are often believed more quickly, but be wary of that, right? At the moment that you learn that maybe, I don't know, like Ibo, who almost won the European Championships, comes by and you judge him, then you're more likely to believe him, right? Because he's achieved stuff, it's the usual kind of thing, but they can still be beaten, right? So that means that you always need to be open towards other things. It also means that you always need to be able to explain why that is the case. So in the beginning of the discussion, a chair will often ask, okay, so David, what was your call? Victor, what was your call? And they will just say, okay, maybe David thought that this was this call, and Victor is like, okay, I think it's a closing half debate. That means that the first and the second go to the closing teams, but he isn't sure. That would mean that he's like, okay, I'm not sure about this. Right? He thinks 3 and 4 go here, but he doesn't know in what order, and 1 and 2 go here, but he doesn't know in what order. And maybe I'm just like, okay, I know that CO took it first, and besides that, I don't know. Right? That's still possible, right, at the moment, but you need to be able to explain why that is the case. If I would only know this, and I'm unsure about the rest, and I would give this as a call, then I would not be able to defend that, right? And then I would be very unuseful within that judging discussion. So I would also, in general, just be honest about it, and just say, okay, I don't have a good idea about this, or I have a very good idea about this, and just say that. If you don't have a full call, that's fine. One thing that I used to do when I started judging, when I was quite insecure, I would just hope that I wasn't the first person that was asked for a call, and then follow the call of the person who answered first. Don't do that. Don't do that, because you won't be able to defend it, and then one, if you want to do well in a tournament and break, that is, judge one of the out rounds, you probably won't get positive feedback if you're not able to defend your goal. But also just in general, if you want to look objectively, you can't give good feedback towards that room and you won't be able to reach a fair goal that you would agree with if you just copy someone else's, right? It's kind of with, if you would copy homework and do nothing else, you would probably still fail the exam because you didn't know what it's like and what the material is, right? So in that case, if you're not sure, just say, I'm not sure, right? That also, one thing at tournaments as well, and I would also do that at Cicero, is also on judging, ask for feedback. Just ask, like, if I was chairing you, you would say, like, hey Mike, do you have any tips? How do you think I weighed off opening government versus opening opposition? Something like that. Always do that also with speaking. Yeah. Okay, cool. Any questions about this? We're almost there already. Tips and tricks. And this is going to be cool stuff. First thing, and this is one of the most useful things that I think help me judging, make calls after every single speech. So that means that after the Prime Minister, you would be, oh yeah, it's won. Because they took it first, there's no one to beat them, right? But that also means that if the leader of opposition, first speaker on the opposition side, would be done with speaking, maybe I don't think that they really, can everyone see this? Maybe I don't think they did enough for opening government, for opening opposition to beat them. I would still think this. Quite likely, after the Deputy Prime Minister, it would stay the same unless they do something really terrible, right? Because they are beating them right now, and if they just don't contradict each other, it will probably stay so. And then the Deputy Leader of Opposition is amazing, and the call will be like this, right? That means that at that point, this call cannot change anymore, right? Only if, for example, opening government gives a really devastating POI to closing opposition and it's just really good, right? Quite likely, at the end of first half, this would be your call. That makes it very easy for you to also give a call in the end because you now know how to weigh off those teams, right? So that means that you can just keep going, doing like this. Maybe closing government gives a good extension. They would now have this, etc. Yeah. That's just the tip that helps me best. Yeah, get used to your own abbreviations. So I've got this sheet here about as also note taking. Please look at this part first. So this is how I would usually write down.
Can you turn the screen off?
Sure. That's it. So this is how I would usually do it. This is the A4, by the way. You can also do it less, but I write down quite a lot. That's one tip. Write down as much as possible, because quite often, especially in higher up rooms, it will be about very specific links that were added, right? Very specific steps in the mechanisms on how they prove that it's true or important or something like that. And then you're able to refer to that, right? You can say, I think opening government beats closing government because of these specific steps. When Tom explained to me that Saudi Arabia acts with regards to oil changes because of these specific relations in the world, that means that you can give concrete evidence for your call. What does the rest mean? So what would I do? I would write down, for example, PM here. That means Prime Minister's speech. I would use one side of the sheet of paper for one speech. So this whole thing is one A4, this is half an A4. If I'm unsure whether they've proven that an argument is true, I put a big T there, right? Just lets me know immediately that I don't know if it's true. Let's say that, this should be like this. Let's say that I think that this one directly defeats an argument on the other side. I would put an arrow or write it down next to it, right here. Because if you would have a lot of arrows, it would be a mess. But if you think it's like if it's oversighty, if you can see it, fine. So this would be drawn there. If I'm not sure if they've proven why it's important, I put the I there. And if I don't believe it whatsoever, if I'm just like, what the fuck did he just say? I put a big cross. Yeah, I sometimes also just do like okay, smiley faces or angry faces or something like that. I would write down general comments as well, like feedback from. I usually write feedback at the bottom here. But that's just something you need to get used to. The large part is if you have abbreviations of your own, use them. Now, I study econometrics. I like mathematics. These two are mathematical sides. Firstly, this is like a V, but then with this, right? That means for every, or you can use every. If they say, for example, every Dutch person does this, or every Dutch person knows this, or every Dutch person yada yada, you can write down every Dutch person, or you can write down, right? It's way quicker, and that also means that if people speak really fastly, like Joshua, for example, you'll be able to write down all of the links that all of the stuff that he says. Same things with there exists. I think I usually use it with exists. Like for example, there exists a group in society that thinks this. You would say, there's a group like that in SOC, right? Government, I would abbreviate with gov. That's not my usual handwriting, it's just the board, by the way. So, I would say, get used to your own abbreviation in society, in Dutch as well. Country names, like Germany, do that with GE or DE or something like that, something you're used to. Yeah, so, and that's kind of just also getting used to, finding out if you have stuff that you use quite a lot. Same thing with rebuttal, for example. This is the sign that I use for rebuttal. Some people write down just an R, use REB, stuff like that, right? Oh, one more sign that I started using quite recently is this sign. It's like a thunder kind of thingy. That means, mathematically, contradiction, right? That can happen as well. Usually happens with closing half teams or if someone contradicts their own material. Maciej, you had a question or a remark?
Wait, I need to remember because I had so much stuff today.
That's fine.
Would it be possible for judges to basically, when judging, to give splits and give basically win to the team that has been slower in pronunciation of things? You know,
Oh yeah,
like
yeah, sure.
Where slower, not that fast.
Yeah, okay, so that's actually a good question. Sometimes at international tournaments, you face people who are English natively, or people that have more problems with that. For example, maybe I have more problems with that because it's my second language, and Tom, because he's a native, would be more well-versed in English, for example. They call that English as a second language, or ESL. You don't want to discredit people for doing that. Maybe they speak slower, but it also means that you probably understand their arguments better because they were more nuanced, because you could follow it. If you would listen to Joshua in a native tongue, he would probably be even more unrecognizable what words he's using, stuff like that, right? So, yeah, so just judge them on the basis of general persuasiveness, but that also means that sometimes don't just be like, this person is ESL, so they should be ranked higher or I should deal with them a little bit easier, right? Because probably people with English as a native tongue are able to be more persuasive because they have better words, they use their words more efficiently, but just make sure to get that out of there. And it's just an inherent human psychological thing, right, to have biases. Yeah, there was one other thing that was with regards to biases. Maybe I'll figure it out a little bit. Yeah.
I have a question about those. So the A4 sheet you use, you have one like for each side, right? So you have one for.
Yeah. So I would have.
So in total you had like in your grade you had.
In total, I would have four sheets.
4 sheets of paper.
I would have 5 actually. That's the thing that I forgot to write down. And this is usually me when I'm sharing, but it's also very handy for yourself. If you have a fifth A4 sheet where you're just writing down. This is a summary of opening government, summary of opening up, etc. And then for stuff that I'm maybe unsure of, for example, I think this one is really close on the government bench. I would write down gov bench and then write down the points why I think opening government beats closing government or something. Makes it easy for you to also get back to that. And also when you're sharing, it's quite handy to put feedback on that piece of paper. It's quite difficult, I've found it, to master the skill of using the fifth sheet because you still want to write down quite a lot. So I would probably say start judging just with the 4 sheets and then maybe in the end, because you get 2 minutes to kind of look over your notes, just to mark the kind of stuff with a marker, with a pencil or something like that that you find important. And definitely do that later. Yeah? I'm trying to think about the bias point that I had. Maybe I'll come up with it later. Okay. Last thing about note-taking is I used to use 4-colored pens, which is green for POIs, red for rebuttal, black for something else, and then blue for own material, something like that. Can be handy if you want to get used to that. I found it really helpful, but right now I'm used to my own way of writing. I just use one color. So with regards to POIs, I wouldn't write them down in green. You can do so, but one thing I use is these square brackets. I will write down who asked the POI, so for example, PM, Prime Minister. I will write down their POI, and then within the brackets, I will write down with an arrow and then the answer. Right? It makes it quite clear who asked the POI, but also where you can find the answer, where you can find the question, stuff like that. Yep. Yep. All clear? Let's see if that is everything. All right. And then the last thing, which is tournaments, and that's going to be really quickly, because I think this is something that you will just learn whenever you're at tournaments yourself, but it's just nice to see it one time. Okay. This is called a speaker skill. You don't need to read whatever is on there.
Jules showed us that last week.
Yeah, Jules did show you. But let's just try to get explain it a little bit. 75 is quite often the tournament average. If you would average the tournament scores that individual people get, because everyone would get a number between 50 and 100, that would quite often turn up to be 75. So if you're judging at a tournament and you think this was probably an average speech, probably that person would get a 75, and you judge upon that. If you don't necessarily know what that is, there are detailed descriptions next to it, which are actually quite good descriptions. So probably what I personally do if I'm chairing, I wouldn't even say what the score is. I would read it out and then say if that person fit the bill. That also meant that I one time I gave like an 85 or an 86, where people were initially thinking that it was like a 78, but also that we gave a like a 60, where people thought it was a 72. So that means that you can deviate quite quickly if you just make sure that you look at this semi-objective scale. Yep. Cool. Is it all clear? Yeah, is it?
Just two questions about the speaker scale. Do you have to give it? Do you have to say this person, or can you say like that? I only know one person.
So you would do that at the end. So that's a good question. The first thing judges do is make the call. That call does not necessarily depend on speaker points. It means that if you rank higher in the debate, you will get higher speaker points in total, right? It's not possible for someone with 2 70s to lose to a team with 2 80s, right? In the end, you can't have low point wins, they call that, right? Everyone gets that, right? Yeah, cool. And then after you've made the call, so only after you have the final result, then you get speaker points. So probably the chair would go, who do we think was the best speaker, stuff like that, right? So, and then in the end, you probably want to make sure that those speaker points add up. But if you're also at a tournament, for example, you don't know how this works, you would probably also just go to the chair and say like, okay, I don't know how speaker scores work, I trust you with it, right? But you can be there, like if they want to give an 80 and you thought, what the fuck, this was average, you can like challenge that.
Alright. And my second question was more like, how, because we talk about breaking, for example, as judge, how do judges get judged? That was never explained.
Yeah, okay, good one. So what I used to do when I started judging at tournaments is, one, I would just ask feedback towards my judges. That also means that my chairs would also see that I am eager to learn. If you fill in feedback yourself on other judges, because you often get these paper forms or on Facebook, they will at least see that you're also eager to participate and to help the chief adjudication team on choosing judges for the final rounds. And if you then also get good feedback, yada yada. So just ask people to give feedback to you on you, so just ask directly for feedback, but also ask them to fill in the feedback form on you. And this is something you'll encounter at tournaments. And then that is probably the way they judge it. Sometimes, I think judging breaks are sometimes more about reputation. So I would be more likely to break at a tournament as a judge than you, right? But that also means that at the moment that you get really positive feedback, there's no way in denying that you're probably a good judge, right? But that's just that. Try to get good feedback, but also try to grow. Same as with speakers, how I would do it at tournaments is ask for specific feedback. How do you think my rebuttal was, etc. Same with judging. Yeah. One thing about this again, which was a thing with the call. Sometimes you would also be like, oh, maybe I'm new to judging, and maybe you had the complete some other way, right? Where's my chalk? So maybe you would have know, 1, 2, 3. That's supposed to be straight. Let's say this was your call and this was the call of the rest. Don't immediately like, oh, okay, you guys have a different call. Okay, I'll concede. I'm fine with that. Because if you gave a full call, you're probably able to explain why you think that was the case, right? Otherwise, you would have probably said, I don't really know what is happening. You can try to convince others because they're people, they're imperfect, they probably missed some steps in the analysis. So one thing is be stubborn, but don't be too stubborn, right? Be willing to listen to other people. Otherwise, it would just be like no discussion would be needed. Everyone would give a call and immediately vote, right? So be able to listen towards other people and just explain really well why you think the call was as such. Now that you often only have 15 minutes, so don't be too long about it. All right. And then, yeah. Are there any other questions?
Sorry. So at tournaments, do you also have, because I've never judged a BP debate, but in Singapore we had like forms where we had to write in all the speakers' scores and also make your call and then write why in like an official form that you submit. Do you also have that? And is that where you write the speakers'
Did you
scores?
say you also had to write down why?
Yeah.
Okay, so at the tournament you would have to fill in those things, but don't necessarily say why.
Okay.
You just give the scores and stuff, but you will notice at tournaments whenever it's not that important to know right now. We don't do that at Cicero, and we don't do individual scores at Cicero either. Did anyone else have a question or remark? No? Awesome. Then we're just going to go and take a break, and then we'll judge a full BP debate and try to apply that. I'll pause it then after the Deputy Leader of Opposition and after the full debate, and we'll start discussing afterwards. But first, let's have a break. Yay!